The honourable member for Isaac. Yep. Honourable member.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm certainly pleased to rise to put on the record my opposition to Labor's carbon tax that it's proposed in this House. Now, there can be no doubt, in considering my remarks ahead of this evening's debate, that the world does need to address the issue of climate change. There can be no doubt that globally mankind is having an impact, and as the father of a 3-year-old son, as someone who looks at what is happening around the world, I cannot help but think to myself that not only is there a certain, and I don't want to overstate in any way, shape or form, but in no doubt is there a certain element of morality to this from one generation to the next. But there is also, I believe, something more fundamentally economically rational about tackling climate change, Mr Deputy Speaker. And that is the fact that for the last 5, 6, perhaps even 10 decades, the world predominantly has relied on one source of fuel, on one source of driving electricity, of generating power to power industry. And this, at its core, Mr Deputy Speaker, has been crucial to the way in which globally we have helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and into a better state of living. It has been at the core of the way in which societies have helped to raise standards of living, to lower infant mortality, to increase lifespans and to make a material difference into humanity's very survival on this planet. But I also think, though, now, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have reached a point where if we apply adequate resource, if we apply adequate ingenuity, we're able to develop and commercialise and harness other renewable forms of electricity in a way that is going to make a difference to our world, to our environment and to mankind going forward. And ultimately, it's in all of our collective interests globally to develop a form of renewable energy that doesn't have a significant detrimental environmental impact. That is just plain good economics. That is just plain good common sense, and that is an approach to this issue, Mr Deputy Speaker, that I believe resonates with that element of as well of the moral obligation that we have as one generation to the next. Now, unfortunately, I would seek to make the bulk of my contribution to consideration and detail on the amendments, Mr Deputy Speaker, because I was gagged from speaking in the main debate that took place earlier today by the government. But that notwithstanding, Mr Deputy Speaker, I feel very strongly about this issue. That's part of the reason why I said to the Leader of the Opposition that I was prepared to fly back from New York, from my secondment to the United Nations, because I wanted to put on the record my opposition to Labor's approach. Now, there can be no doubt, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said, that we as a nation do have an obligation to act on climate change. We do have an obligation to do that. But this is not the correct approach. Labor's approach to tackling climate change through the introduction of a carbon tax, and in a more deceitful way, Mr Deputy Speaker, through the introduction of a carbon tax without a mandate. In fact, quite the opposite, with a Prime Minister who vowed only days out from the last election that if elected they would not introduce a carbon tax, is not the approach. The key to ensuring a success in a reform like this is to ensure that the community has ownership of the reform. And Labor's approach provides no community ownership whatsoever. The fact is that this is a significant reform that absolutely must be done in lockstep with global action. To do so unilaterally, despite the pressing need for there to be action on climate change, Mr Deputy Speaker, despite the issues that I've raised about economic consequence, and despite the fact that I do believe there is a moral obligation to deal with climate change, to do so effectively unilaterally, to impose such a significant impost on the Australian economy when the rest of the world is not at that point, is economic recklessness. And it's economic recklessness because it is blind ideology. Blind ideology that drives an agenda, Mr Deputy Speaker, that doesn't look to the stark reality that in order to perform meaningful change, in order to foster and to grow meaningful ownership throughout a community of a reform that takes place, you must ensure the community is going to be better off for it. And there are some elements of this debate, Mr Deputy Speaker, that can simply not be ignored. Principal among them, and I'm mindful of the time, Mr Deputy Speaker, so I'd seek the call again.
Order. The member will resume his seat. Honourable Member for Latrobe.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to participate again in this debate, and particularly following the member from Moncrieff, who has so significantly acknowledged that action on climate change is such a moral imperative, and who has acknowledged that that there is a need to take urgent action on climate change, because it's not often that you get those concessions consistently from members of the opposition, and certainly it's very unlikely that we are to get on any given day, and indeed consecutive days, those sorts of concessions from the Leader of the Opposition. This is certainly an historic occasion for those of us on this side of the House who have assiduously committed ourselves to moving along a very significant policy initiative for our environment, for business certainty, to create the kind of long-term opportunity, long-term prosperity that we know is necessary and we know is required in relation to the development of clean energy industries in order to give Australians jobs into the future and in order to sustain the kind of economic circumstances that we find ourselves in presently. By contrast, we see those opposite, and certainly in the most recent statements of the Leader of the Opposition in moving his amendment, we see hysteria, we see continuing hysteria, we see a bid to delay significant action on climate change, we see a policy vacuum, we see a leadership vacuum. The Leader of the Opposition's amendments today seem to me to be more about distraction, and you might ask, distraction from what? And I think the most significant thing that the Leader of the Opposition wants to distract all of us from with his amendment is his failure to support the steel industry in this country through the Steel Transformation Plan. And it's curious because not long ago the Leader of the Opposition visited and spoke at the Australian Steel Convention, and he said, "The steel industry is very important to Australia's economy. From smelting to fabricating, steel employs about 90,000 people, critical to so many other sections of our economy as well." He said, "So steel is critical to our way of life. Steel is important in our economy. And I've been making the point uphill and down Dale since the carbon tax was first announced." Well, he's been uphill, he's been down Dale, and occasionally he's snuck off the edge of the dale and into the gutter. In fact, more often than not, he's found himself there. But unfortunately today, despite his several pages of oration to the Australian Steel Convention, he seems incapable of coming into this place and supporting and encouraging those who sit alongside him to practically give support to the steel industry. And instead he comes up with another fig leaf, which is this sad little amendment, which is a bid to delay one of the most significant reforms being made to our economy, one of the most significant environmental reforms being made in our country's history. And he will inevitably, and his colleagues in the Senate most likely, will try to oppose significant endeavours to continue to support the steel industry. So despite all of the rhetoric, all of the visits to steel mills, all of the wearing of hard hats and pretending to be out doing hard graft alongside Australian workers, once again, when it comes to actually making a decision and taking a vote, Mr Abbott is off having another siesta. This reform that we are pursuing today and have pursued long and hard for many months now, and indeed, as one of the previous speakers mentioned, our action on initiatives such as this and action on climate change has been many years indeed in the making. Our efforts are about ensuring that electorates such as mine benefit from the development of clean energy industries, clean energy technologies. They're about ensuring that electorates such as mine, which have significant areas of environmental heritage, are duly protected and are not exposed to extreme weather events such as bushfire. My electorate covers an area including much of the Dandenong Ranges, so I'm very familiar with the environmental impacts that are likely to flow from inaction on climate change. So, contrary to the reformist, forward-thinking initiatives of this government, all that those opposite and the Leader of the Opposition can offer to the Australian people is delay, is a policy vacuum, is a leadership vacuum, and that's simply not good enough.
Order. The Honourable Member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. As I was saying earlier, there are some facts about this debate that simply cannot be ignored. First among them, in my view, in order of significance, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the fact that at its core, Labor's policy, which would effectively penalise the Australian economy vis-a-vis other industrialised economies, will see a 5% reduction in emission levels when Australia currently contributes around 1.5% of global emissions. So we are talking about imposing a multi-billion-dollar tax on the Australian economy. We're talking about imposing a significant burden which must be shared by households, by small businesses, by large businesses across the Australian economy to make a 5% reduction to global emissions of 1.5%. And the lunacy of Labor's approach in this, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I heard it from the Speaker immediately prior to me, is that Labor makes out, and this is the great con job, this is the great con job that lies at the core of this debate. Labor makes out that it's a choice between positives under their approach or nothing. That it's in some way an approach that forces Australians to choose between policy benefits that might flow, I should say economic benefits that might flow from this policy or nothing. Now, can I put unequivocally on the record that I believe that there are benefits that flow from a shift to renewables. I've already indicated as such. But the key difference from my perspective and from Labor's approach, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that it must be done in lockstep with other developed economies, because there are costs associated with this reform, costs which cannot be ignored. And whilst it might suit the arguments of Labor members to claim that it is only ever filled with positives, there are significant and real economic disadvantages that will directly flow from Labor's imposition of this tax. Now, I'm very willing to concede that there are benefits that will flow in time as well. And I say let's embrace these benefits. And we embrace these benefits, Mr Deputy Speaker, by doing so in lockstep with other developed economies, because by doing that, Mr Deputy Speaker, we ensure that the disadvantages that are felt immediately, as opposed to the longer-term benefits which will flow in due course, are not done in a unilateral way. And I must say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that if I talk about my own constituency of Moncrieff on the Gold Coast, there can be perhaps no clearer example of the difference between long-term benefits and short-term costs than the tourism industry. Under Labor's proposal that we have before the House, it's now been passed in terms of the second reading speech, Mr Deputy Speaker, we have a situation where international tourists coming to Australia will pay more because of the result of Labor's carbon tax with no compensation. There is no international compensation for tourists travelling to Australia. So for 70 or 80% of the Australian economy, the services side of the economy, who will be facing increased costs, there will be no global compensation for them. They will pay more. And they will have to pay more to visit Australia vis-a-vis other countries that aren't doing this. And what will their choice be, Mr Deputy Speaker? If you believe in the basic laws of supply and demand, when the price goes up, fewer people will demand the product. Point number one. Point number one. The second point, I hear the Minister at the table asking, should we compensate them for the Australian dollar too? So the Minister at the table concedes that the tourism industry is already being battered by an Australian dollar that is so sky high, and says, oh, well, they've already got that problem, so why would we worry about this other problem? This is the lunacy of this government. This is the lunacy of an approach that says, well, you're already doing it tough because of this factor, so what's one more nail in the coffin as far as the government's concerned? So there's no compensation for international tourists. In addition to that, under Labor's policy, there'll be no carbon tax payable on a flight overseas for an Australian, but there will be a price payable in the carbon tax to holiday domestically. So in addition to there being a disadvantage of Australia vis-a-vis other countries around the world, under Labor's policy, to holiday domestically will cost you more, but to holiday internationally won't cost you more. And that in some way makes sense to the Labor Party as well. So right there, just using that one industry as an example, Mr Deputy Speaker, we can already see the immediate upfront economic disadvantage that flows to the Australian economy versus long-term, perhaps even unquantifiable, largely qualitative benefits that will flow to the Australian economy as a result of Labor's changes. The simple issue is, Mr Deputy Speaker, these reforms must be done in lockstep with the rest of the economy, with the rest of the world.
For Crosby.